Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. First, we would like to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva and Keech Nation peoples and their neighbors. From north to south, the Chumash, Tatavian, Kitanamuk, Serrano, Kawiya, Piyam-Kawicham, Awashaman, Ipai-Tipai, Punyai, and Quechan peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of the lands, river systems, and the waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For more detailed land acknowledgement authored by the USC Van Hunnick History Department, we invite you to visit their website, which we will put in the chat. And for those of you joining us online, we'd love to know where you're watching from, so feel free to drop your location where you're watching from in the chat as well. My name is Autumn Watts. I'm the program assistant here at the USC Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and I'm delighted to welcome you, those of you who are here in person and online, to our first event of the spring semester. Just a couple notes about Zoom protocols for our online audience. Right now you're viewing a side-by-side view of the speaker and the slides we're sharing. You can make either window larger or smaller by dragging the dividing line between the two windows left or right. And we'll have time for questions and discussion following the lecture, so we encourage you to ask your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom, or you can drop them in the chat as well, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible towards the end of the lecture. We'll also be sharing the chat and Q&A with our speaker today, so even if your question does not get answered, our speaker will see it and hopefully get back to you. So now we introduce today's lecturer and our speaker. It's my pleasure to introduce the Associate Director of the USC Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Martha Shaw.
Thank you, Autumn. And thank you to Autumn and Janice for everything, all the preparation leading up to the lecture. Thank you all for being here, those of you in person and those of you joining us online. Thanks for coming. To those of you in person, thank you for braving the elements today. It makes your presence here extra appreciated. So, as Autumn mentioned, today is our first event of the spring semester, and this is the first of 8 lectures that we have coming up in the next 9 weeks. Yes, we'll be having talks about a wide range of events from scholars from a wide range of disciplines, not to mention delicious lunches every week, or almost every week except for spring recess for the remainder of the semester. So we invite you to join us. To tell you a little bit about the center, for those of you who may not be familiar, since our founding in 2014, the USC Center for Advanced Genocide Research has dedicated itself to advancing new areas of interdisciplinary research on the Holocaust, genocide, mass violence, and resistance. We focus on research as the foundation for all levels of Holocaust and genocide education. We promote research with the unique resources at USC in the areas of Holocaust and genocide studies, including the Visual History Archive, the Holocaust and Genocide Studies book collection, special collections at USC libraries, and others. And all of this is to transform the ways that we understand the origins, dynamics, and consequences of mass violence, as well as the conditions and dimensions of resistance. We manage a rich academic program, including international conferences, fellowship programs. We welcome visiting scholars, organize workshops, organize lectures and lunches. We're proud of the lunches, and offering unique research opportunities. One aspect of our program that we're very committed to is fostering research research by undergraduate students at USC and beyond USC, which is what brings us here today. This semester, we're hosting talks by 4 undergraduate fellows. And Nadia gets to go first. Next week, we have another lecture by Anna Hunter, another undergraduate fellow, about designing a computer game based on her research into perpetrators going unpunished during the Holocaust and in the Jim Crow South. So we invite you to join us. Same time next Tuesday. So now we'll talk about Nadia and the fellowship that she holds. We're here for the lecture of our 2025 Beth and Arthur Lev Student Research Fellow, Nadia Al-Ani. First bestowed in 2018, this fellowship enables USC students, both graduate students and undergraduate students, to work with the resources at USC for a research project of their own design. We offer our deepest thanks to Beth and Arthur Lev, whose generosity has supported 7 undergraduate fellows and 7 graduate fellows. I'm very happy to see so many USC students in the room. And I just want to say, if you're a USC student and you're intrigued by these resources or the themes of our work, our applications are open now for the Lev Fellowship for the summer 2026, as well as several other undergraduate fellowships. So we encourage you to visit our website to learn more and apply. And if you're not sure how to turn your interests into a research question or into a project, send us an email and we can help support you with that. So now to Nadia. Nadia Al-Ani is a senior who is double majoring in international relations and philosophy, politics, and law. She's also pursuing a master's in global security studies. She was one of 3 USC students nominated to represent USC at the Global Peace Summit at the United Nations Conference Center in Bangkok, Thailand in January, alongside 450 delegates from 60 countries, a real honor. She served as a legal intern with Global Lawyers for Refugees, advocating for vulnerable populations through legal research, application support, and international human rights petitions, particularly for asylum seekers from South Asia. And she also contributed to the National Civic League's Healthy Democracy Research team. She currently serves as a client navigator to the USC SPD Tech Human Rights Clinic on campus. She writes about justice, identity, and global politics for USC publications, such as the USC Global Policy Institute, for which she serves as an editorial fellow. She is the director of the DEI and programming chair at the USC chapter of the United Nations Association of the United States of America. Before we welcome her, we want to express our gratitude to the USC Institute of Armenian Studies, who consulted with Nadia during her research and who are co-sponsors of this lecture. Now, please join me in welcoming Nadia Al-Ani.
Thank you, Martha, for that introduction. Before I begin, I would also like to give a thanks and my deepest gratitude to the Beth and Arthur Lev Student Research Fellowship donors for making this research possible, as well as the USC Center for Advanced Genocide Research for helping me and supporting me through this work. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Janice. Thank you, Autumn. And thank you to my brilliant cohort of fellows who couldn't be with us here in person, but I know that they're watching, so thank you, Alexa. And thank you, Viria, for your support, for your guidance, your insight, and your constant inspiration throughout this journey. The work that I present today centers around memory, survival, and displacement, and the enduring resilience of a community that is often left out of the dominant narratives on the Armenian Genocide. According to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, genocide is defined as acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. What the survivors of the Armenian Genocide endured, forced marches, mass executions, starvation, cultural erasure, fits this definition with devastating precision. And yet genocide does not end with the last bullet or the last final death march. It lingers in the silences, in the shattered communities, the lost languages, and the fractured identities of survivors and their descendants. Today, I'll be focusing on the lesser-known geography of this genocide in Iraq. We often hear about Armenian displacement into different Middle Eastern countries like Lebanon, Syria, and into the Caucasus, into Georgia, or into Russia. But Iraq, which is positioned at the crossroads of empire and exile, became a space for both refuge and re-traumatization for many Armenians who were double and sometimes triple displaced. This is a story of survival, yes, but it is also one of cultural resilience and erasure. So let us begin with some historical context. All right. Actually, before I give you the historical context, I would like to start off by saying that I compiled my research through the Visual History Archive that Martha mentioned, which is an amazing resource to anyone who is able to do these student fellowships. You get access to thousands of genocide testimonies, which is what I used. I used 13 Arabic Armenian genocide survivor testimonies in order to compile this research. And I also will be using some clips from an interview I conducted over the summer when discussing this. And I would also like to flag that there is a lack of information about the Armenian genocide survivors that were displaced into Iraq, which is why I think it is so important to have this presentation. As I mentioned, this is an understudied part of the Armenian genocide, and the lack of testimony, both in the Visual History Archive and through publications online, is a testament to the erasure that many Armenians have had to endure in their stories and their personal histories. And now for some historical background, before you can understand these testimonies that you're going to hear today, I would like to briefly revisit how Iraq became a site of refuge and later a site of loss for so many Armenian survivors and their descendants. So in 1915, the Ottoman Empire began its systematic campaign to annihilate the Armenian population. Hundreds of thousands were murdered, marched to their deaths, or deported across the Syrian desert. For those who survived this initial massacre, they did not end their journey there, not in Aleppo or Deir ez-Zor or any other part of Syria. They were actually pushed further east towards what is now modern-day Iraq. And that is how Iraq became a corridor of refuge. I know this personally because I am Iraqi and I grew up with so many of my fellow Armenian neighbors, friends, and family, but I know that many people do not know this. And again, that is a testament to why this is such important research to be put out there. Survivors passed through Syria and they trickled into what is northern Iraq, especially into towns like Sinjar, Mosul, Kirkuk, and Baghdad. Some were shuffled between orphanages, others found shelter within Arab, Kurdish, or Assyrian families. And over time, these Armenians built churches, schools, choirs, and tight-knit communities, institutions that became central to preserving their identity across generations. But that refuge was very fragile. First came the instability of British and French mandates after World War I, then the nationalization and authoritarian shifts of the Saddam Hussein era, and finally the 2003 US invasion and the rise of ISIS. Moments that shattered these fragile communities again and again. Now, what's critical to understand is that Armenians in Iraq were doubly or triply displaced in many of these cases, first from Anatolia, or what is now referred to as Western Armenia, then from Syria, and then again within Iraq due to these instabilities that I just listed. So these testimonies, they don't just speak to the trauma of genocide, they speak to the long, unrelenting aftermath of exile. So before moving further into the testimonies themselves, I would like to briefly reflect on the process of conducting this research, because research doesn't happen in a vacuum. So methodologically, as I outlined, this is kind of how I went about the research through the testimonies, the USC Shoah Foundation Visual History Archive, an interview that I will later be showing you clips of, as well as few direct testimonies within the Visual History Archive. So this research took place during a period of significant political instability, both regionally and locally. I conducted my research this past summer of 2025, where I was originally going to go home to Iraq and interview Armenians and their descendants in a lot of the refugee camps and Armenian churches that I was going to talk about. Unfortunately, I did not get the opportunity to do that. Israeli missiles strikes on Iran temporarily closed regional airspaces, affecting travel plans and communications. And at the same time, here in Los Angeles, curfews were imposed on downtown LA, where I reside, as crackdowns on protesters responding to ICE raids were taking place. The deployment of the National Guard and even Marines created an atmosphere of visible militarization. And while these events did not halt my research, they altered the emotional and psychological landscape of which it unfolded. And studying genocide testimonies while witnessing contemporary militarization, border enforcement crackdowns, and political instability brought into sharp focus how fragile safety can be, especially for minorities and displaced communities. It underscored a core theme of my project, that displacement is not a closed historical chapter, it is a reoccurring condition. These circumstances also deepened my awareness of how archives function, because when borders close and airspaces are shut down, when protests are policed and access to information becomes restricted. That reality made the act of preservation and listening carefully to testimony feel much more urgent. So the challenge of this project was not limited to locating resources. It included navigating research during a moment when questions of state power, militarization, migration, and minority vulnerability were not actually abstract anymore. They were unfolding in real time. So in that sense, this project was not only an academic inquiry, it was also a mediation on continuity and how the structures that displace people persist across generations. So now that I've laid out the broader historical landscape, I want to bring us into the heart of this project, the testimonies. As I mentioned earlier, I watched over a dozen Arabic language testimonies from the Shoah Foundation's Visual History Archive, and while they were not all centered on Iraq, many included fragments, moments, and memories that spoke directly to the Iraqi-Armenian experience. So I will be sharing clips from a select few, but I will also reference others that did not make it to this presentation, but are still very important to share, and they helped shape my understanding. So I'm going to start playing the very first clip, and I do warn that what is described is very graphic, so if you do need to take a moment to go outside, please feel free to do so. So the first clip I will be sharing is from Hagop Karayan, who described the mass graves in Deir ez-Zor, Syria, and having to go into Baghdad after witnessing what he did.
3 gün bizi sakladılar, hem de sakladılar, halal olsun. Yemeklerle. Ha. Ama büyük kardeşlerim, onlar bizden ayrıldılardı. Ha. Onları Rakka'da tutuklar, asıklar. İkisini, Lütfik'le Kevorki. Ha. Asıklar onlar orada. Vardık biz Musul'a, bir banka doldurdular. Asuri Bankı'na. 3 ayın içinde 4000 kişiden 300 kişi kaldı. Ha. Orada eşitlik ki derdoru kesiyorlar, paltayla, kürekle kırıyorlar, parçalıyorlar. Ha. Orada kerizman yoktu, bir çukur açarlardı, düzerlerdi. 50 tane, üstüne bir 10 santim toprak, bir sıra daha düzerler, 10 santim toprak, bir sıra daha düzerler. Ki ta ki çukur dolana kadar. Ha. Hangi kerizman etsin herif oraya? Ha.
So, this clip is deeply disturbing, of course, but it is very important because it speaks to the mechanized brutality of the genocide and how even death was industrialized, with people, 50 people, being buried under only 10 centimeters of dirt and stacked with rows and rows above them. Very mechanical way of going about this genocide. And Hagop later described how he was sent into Mosul, northern Iraq, after both of his brothers were caught and hung in Syria. He was later housed by a Kurdish family, and he describes how the transnational nature of Armenian suffering was profound to their experience. And Syria was not the endpoint, as they were then moved into Iraq. The next clip I will be showing is of Hovannes Karayan, who described how play this.
Üç gün bizi
Sorry, my clips are not arranged the way I thought they would be. Okay. The next clip actually is of Duruhi Avidian, who talked about massacres in the Euphrates River when she was fleeing from Anatolia into Syria and then into Iraq, where her sister was actually killed, and the way that people were targeted.
Ogune togin aganchu gudren, madani une togin mad gudren, aparanchu une togin cerke gudren, hakustune togin gunan gudren, kumana adakchigas, al asfalt yardımne. Memnun ayım var, kuyrusa cerkes purnaze. Egan cerkes zargin, astığıs zargazın hos zargin, kuyrusarin, kuyrus pora zaman kuyrus, diruy indi darin, müşkürnamener. Vrei hakusta hanazer, yesal mergem, polorovin mergem. Andega ayrım mıgar, giner mi, marter mi, mostovazer. Yes ayronin meçe, tarsa mınasi. Alpes, şemzarnı var.
So in Duruhi's experience, she had to play dead and lie in her sister's blood for hours on end, as she did not want to be slaughtered and face the same fate as her sister and thousands of other Armenians. She was thankfully rescued by an Arab family in northern Iraq, and I'm going to play a clip after this of her experience with that, and something that I would like to make note of, because you will see this in the second clip I will play after that as well, regarding how Armenians were able to maintain their identity when they were displaced into Iraq, and how they were able to hold on to what was actively being attacked.
Cerkels. Verçu inş betegavne, ganküs egav, Arapnerum meçinga. Pais minçay, şat panır desa, şat. Ega, memnan ayın bol bombardaman gılla. Kıntakner gınetvi, Fransatine göre, ginma asan kudeze. Ega vısa vor, asakçı kudeze misav. Vor sav tezi besırla yefçitani misav. Egan jagados dedetin, bizdik masi, veşnal serkis dedetin, astığı yeres dedetin. Men kal paxank, serkis uretsav, yeresi suretsav, paxank Arapnerun voru vordun mıdaneyes. Anun şedi paxank lerkatsink, veşnal dun veratartsank, veşçe.
So in Duruhi's experience, as many other Armenians faced, and as I described before, there was often elements of double and even triple displacement in Iraq due to political instability, believe it or not, in the early 20th century. So at this time, there was a French occupation in northern Iraq, as well as a British occupation in southern Iraq. And that is what had led to the family that was hosting her to have to run away into the mountains. And the only way that they could identify one another was through the tattoos that she described, in which they tattooed her so that everyone would assume she was an Arab and she could not be targeted by Ottoman forces, but also so that her Arab host family could identify her. And in case they were to get lost, that would be a very easy way to spot one another. And I found that this was actually a common pattern for a lot of Armenians, both in the Visual History Archive and through some peer-reviewed research that I conducted as well. And that's why I felt it necessary to include. It's just one way that many of these Armenians were able to preserve their identity and ensure their safety. So the next clip that I will be playing is of a man who had a similar story, in that he also did a similar tattoo, but for different reasons.
Yes, hayos topros katsade, haç mı kızeti, yeme menan ayıp mı kızeti, yeme kadar bedros be anunov pam mı kızeti sev.
Şu atbaneri.
Vore vede hayıtunuz çıkorsun sunyola haber, yete voyeve hayma vadahi vor, inci vore vede darazız Kürdi yev Arabi beser, haymi yapor desnayı, bidi sevor, yes hayem, inçen haytni bidirler, haçı suçu var, Kristonyayım. Ayıp suçu var, hayos toprosu ayıp penesi. İs anunusal beeselo, anika öriyesi, başbeso, anu kızetil, yes kızetil, yamanınkal asego, asev, haçı pada, haçı severin, ayıp severin,
So in the case of Bedros Shabarigyan, he was an Armenian who was displaced into northern Iraq as well, who lost his family along the way in Syria, and was housed in an orphanage by Assyrian families who are a Christian minority group in northern Iraq. And he was actually able to attend an Armenian school because there were so many orphan children that were Armenian genocide survivors. However, he was also constantly moved around after, I didn't include a clip because this was about like an hour-long interview, but he was moved around due to both French bombardment and British forces taking over. So at first he was in northern Iraq, then he went to Baghdad, and then to the south in Basra, and then to the Gulf of Aden, which is in modern-day Yemen, and then brought back to northern Iraq. And he talked about how this cross was the only thing he had with him to hold on to his identity, especially since the second he met other orphans and was reunited with some sense of familiarity, he was again displaced. And that tends to be kind of a recurring theme for a lot of these Armenian genocide survivors. So I found it very interesting and very beautiful as well that many of them were able to maintain their identities with something as simple as a tattoo, because as he said, he was kind of dressed in traditional Kurdish and Arab garments, so no one would really be able to know what his background is. And seeing as he had lost his family, that was kind of the only thing that would keep his identity tethered to him. So those are all the clips I wanted to show, but as I said, there are many others that, for the sake of time, I didn't include, but would like to talk about. So the first other person I'd like to discuss is Garabed Kelanjian, who was a survivor that was living under Sinjar and Yazidi protection, which Yazidis are another minority group in northern Iraq, and Sinjar was the mountainous range between the border and like the intersection, I guess you could say, of both Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. So that's why many Armenians ended up there, just because of the route through Syria leading directly to the Sinjar Mountains. So Kelanjian described being deported from Tikirida, passing through Izmir and Konya, which are cities in modern-day Turkey, and then eventually arriving in Syria before being taken into Sinjar in northwestern Iraq. He lived among Yazidis for 7 or 8 years, working as a shepherd and surviving through manual labor. His testimony highlights something crucial, that Iraq was not simply a destination. It was actually a place where Armenians were absorbed into existing minority landscapes, Yazidis, Assyrians, Kurdish peoples, and survived through intercommunal relationships with these groups. Serpuki Papazian was an Armenian who was married into a Syrian Arab family and eventually identified more closely with an Arab identity than an Armenian. She tattooed her initials as well onto her wrist in order to preserve her Armenian identity. And as she was able to marry an Arab Christian, that she didn't have to convert or anything. And she also emphasized the Arabs across the Levant and Gulf helped a lot of Armenians throughout these deportations. And her story actually complicates the narrative of erasure because while identity could fade linguistically as it did for her, and she stopped really identifying with the Armenian identity of her since she was raised in an Arab family and eventually married someone who was Arab, she was still emotionally present in her Armenian identity. And while she may not have identified with it in a traditional sense, she did still maintain it. Garabet Kacho was taken in as a baby after his father was killed. He grew up unaware that he was Armenian. He was raised among tribes with Iraqi roots, speaking Arabic and Kurdish. He represents a different form of survival, one in which Armenian identity was not preserved consciously, but buried beneath layers of adaptation. And show this one, perfect. Sorry, I have a lot of these testimonies. I didn't want to show all of them as I know that would take so long, but okay. Father Antranik Ayvazian was collecting bones in Syria of Armenian genocide martyrs, and he spoke of Syria as a graveyard deliberately created by Ottoman planning. Importantly, he also described Sinjar and Mosul in Iraq as locations where Armenians were able to rebuild life and where they were able to preserve Armenianism along with those who had adopted Arab culture. So eventually he had gathered enough bones in order to dispute Ottoman claims that the Armenian genocide was simply a result of war, not an actual targeted campaign in order to annihilate the Armenian population, And he also helped establish a church in Syria that was an Armenian church where many of these remains were kept and do still exist today. Along his preservation efforts, others are now trying to do the same in Syria. And Madloul Al-Awsi Mazar is an Arab who adopted an Armenian boy and was able to help him get married into an Armenian family as well. There was actually a very common practice of adopting Armenians and then kind of arranging marriages for them with other Armenians that were also adopted by Arab families as a kind of communal effort or a local effort to make sure that the Armenian identities weren't taken away and that Armenians still had an opportunity to practice their Armenianism and still engage in their cultures. So in that testimony, he talked about kind of the different families and how they reunited Armenians in that way and gave them the opportunity to kind of maintain their culture in that sense. So together, these voices form a mosaic, which is layered, scattered, but connected, and they set the emotional tone, and historical backdrop that make the live clips I've shown you all the more poignant. Obviously, everything I've described is from the visual history archive testimonies that are directly related to Iraq and the ones that I had watched and researched a bit, but everything I've been talking about has already taken place. It's all in the past. So I kind of want to connect it into the modern day contemporary in Iraq and why this all ties in basically. So over the summer, as I mentioned, I originally had plans to visit Armenian orphanages and churches, which was of course disrupted by airspaces being closed and my travel plans being canceled. But I was still able to conduct one virtual interview with an Iraqi Armenian. She was actually a very close friend of my mother's and her college classmates, and they still keep in contact. So I called her up and I was like, can I please kind of know a bit about your story, as I know her kids, and I know that her family kind of knew my family, so it was perfect. And she kind of told me about what her experience was like as an Iraqi Armenian, especially with the tragic events of the US invasion and the rise of ISIS and how that impacted Armenian Iraqis as they were such a minority and obviously a Christian group, which made them that much more liable to such attacks. So I'm going to include a couple of clips. They are a bit long, but I do think they're very important because she outlines a lot of her experience growing up in Iraq, which I feel people may not be familiar with or may not be able to comprehend until they kind of see it. So her name is Anna Bedrosian, and here is the first clip of her talking about the shift from the 20th century displacement into the modern day aftershocks of genocide. And her story, I think, is very important to share. So
yes, so the good thing about Iraq was, or Iraq, which is the real way you pronounce it, it opened all the doors for Armenians to practice their religion, their heritage, learn the language. So we were not suppressed by all means to practice all these, which was really a big deal, and it was it allowed us to live, like create a little Armenia, I would say, and live it within the bigger group. So we had our clubs, the Armenian clubs, sports clubs, that we would play sports. We had community centers, many community centers in Baghdad. Of course, I'm talking about Baghdad in particular because that's the place where I grew up in, but the other provinces as well had churches and community centers. Basra is one of the big cities that had lots of Armenians. Mosul, of course, Mosul, Basra, Kirkuk, Duhok, like all these places had Armenian churches, Armenian schools, Armenian community centers. So we went to an Armenian school as well growing up, like from kindergarten to until grade 12. I went to a school that taught Armenian as well, and that was like, it was a program by the government. So yes, all my life I felt I lived as an Armenian and Iraqi at the same time. But as I said, we had dance groups, we had choirs, the church, the clubs, sports clubs, and all that, scouts, like everything, you name it, everything we had. Yeah, that was Armenian. But the great thing is that we were not suppressed to practice all these things, and as opposed to being suppressed. You know, in some places you can't do all that, but we were lucky.
So I think Anna would want me to share this. She had such a great experience in a lot of her country clubs and dance groups that she now resides in Canada and started her own dance school to teach children traditional Armenian dances. And she is very involved within the Armenian community in Canada. And she was kind of telling me later on in this interview that she was still in contact with a lot of her teachers and dance coaches and people that were kind of with her growing up in Iraq, and she took whatever they taught her and made sure to implement it. I'm also going to show a clip later on of why she chose to flee Iraq in 2003, but many people didn't know that there are country clubs, there are choir groups, there's Armenian churches and Armenian schools in Iraq that were funded by the government. They were government programs, and they helped maintain the fabric of these Armenian communities. Even though, as I showed with some of the testimonies before, a lot of them were double or triple displaced, they still had access to resources that would help them maintain their identities. And unfortunately, due to the political instability that exists in Iraq now, that is no longer the case. And the majority of Armenians did have to flee, which I will show some statistics on later. But as she said, polo clubs, scout camps, dance recitals, she never once felt as if she didn't belong, which I obviously think should always be the case, but unfortunately wasn't so for many Armenians, and especially now after so many had to flee, as I mentioned. The second clip I'm going to show is about her family and how they were integrated into Iraqi society. So she's going to talk about kind of like their involvement in the government and just how integrated they were during the Iraq-Iran war, as well as being employed in the military as well.
Close to the let's say Saddam government at the time, but he trusted them. Do you know Saddam's youngest daughter, Hala, her nanny was Armenian. The nanny who raised her, her name was Aghavni, which translates to hamama. Dove, not dove, no.
Pigeon.
Pigeon.
Yes.
So she basically took care of Hala. So there was a lot of trust in Armenians. Armenians mainly worked in craftsmanship, things that had to do with hands, arts, and all that. During the Iran war, of course, the Armenian men joined the war just like anyone else because they're Iraqis after all, and they were born there. So my father was a soldier and my uncle was a soldier. So they just like everyone else in Iraq, and we have so many martyrs that are Armenians. Actually, the graveyard that's behind the church, there are lines of martyrs who were lost in the Iraqi-Irani war, and they're Armenians. So there was nothing, we felt.
I don't know why I cut that clip there, sorry. But kind of, not that I need to comment, I think she did a great job explaining this, but her family, as well as many other Armenian families, were very well integrated into the government at the time and were obviously doing things every single other Iraqi was doing. And as she mentioned, in her local church in Baghdad, the Armenian church, there was many martyrs that were buried there as they were deployed in the Iran war. And the level of trust for Armenians goes as deep as she mentioned, Saddam Hussein's daughter's nanny was Armenian. As we know, he was a very brutal dictator, but even he didn't have a reason to doubt the Armenians or suppress them. That is just how well integrated they were into Iraqi society at the time. Doesn't change the fact that he is a terrible person, but it shows that it shows that Armenians were kind of treated no different from Iraqis, and unfortunately that's not how the story is told, as there was such a big population of Iraqi Armenians that are completely neglected from the modern day narrative of the Armenian Genocide. So the next clip I'm going to play is of her talking about the 2003 US invasion and how that impacted her family and why it led to her fleeing as well as the rest of her family. Threats discriminatory because they were Christian or Armenian, or was it just a general result of the war that, you know, other people were receiving very similar threats?
Close to the
Were those threats discriminatory because, okay, I did not explain this well enough. I'm asking her about threats that her family received during the 2003 invasion, and I was kind of inquiring as to whether those threats were specific to the fact that her family was Armenian, or whether they were kind of general threats. And this is kind of when things started to unfold and the political instability was at an all-time high and led to her family as well as thousands of other Armenian families fleeing. So that's kind of what I'm asking about. They were Christian or Armenian, or was it just a general result of the war that, you know, other people were receiving very similar threats?
I'm not sure. I'm sure other people received many threats for different reasons, but because my father was the only Christian living in that neighborhood, or I would say Christian left living in that neighborhood, because we had many Christian people, our families living in the neighborhood, but because they all fled and he was the last one, he didn't want to leave. He didn't want to leave Iraq. So even my mom took my sister and two brothers and went to Syria, lived there for 3 years, and my dad wouldn't join them. He's like, I'm not leaving here. This is my home. Until he got the threats. He said, well, they would tell him, the purpose was money. He would put money. Actually, he would bribe them. He would put money, like, of course, American dollars, as they.
So, in Anna's case, as well as many Iraqi families, not just specific to Armenians, during the US invasion, there was a lot of gang and sectarian violence, which led to people being threatened, especially minority groups which were specifically targeted. As she mentioned, while the neighborhood she lived in had a big Christian and Armenian population, that was no longer the case after the war, so it made it that much easier for her father to be targeted, and he was kind of given notes of left in the mailbox or outside his door, you know, you need to give us money, otherwise we'll hurt you, we'll hurt your family. And while her mother and siblings were able to flee to Syria and she was able to flee to Canada with her husband, her father refused to leave, and he was there for about 3 more years until they were asking for money that he could no longer give, and he was threatened to be killed, and that's when he eventually fled. Unfortunately, that, like I said, was the case for many Iraqis, Armenians, and Arabs alike, but yeah, let's see what this next part.
So I left months before the war, and a year later, when things were unstable, that's when my family started to get threats. That's when they started to get those. We don't know who these people are, to be honest. We never knew these people exist. But they started to threaten my brothers that we're going to kill you. They started threatening my father that if you don't put money in such box and such location, we won't be protecting you. So it became nasty. So they had to flee the country. It was after the regime was gone. I'm not saying the regime was good. I only speak general, but after the regime, war brings everything. You know, war brings the bad people.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
So I left months before the war, and a year later, that if you don't put money in such box and such location, we won't be protecting you. So it became nasty. So they had to flee the country. It was after the regime was gone. I'm not saying the regime was good. I only speak general, but after the regime, war brings everything. You know, war brings the bad people because there's chaos. There's no law. So everybody started to do their business by themselves. I call it business, either making money or whoever has grudge with someone over, you never know, an egg or something would go kill them. So crazy stuff happened, and that.
So I hope that you all also thought that Anna's story was very important and very poignant to this research. I think that her story isn't an isolated one because it echoes what happened to thousands of Armenians across Iraq following the fall of the Saddam Hussein regime. And the 2003 US invasion did not simply dismantle that Ba'athist regime, it dismantled fragile sectarian balance. And what we have now is militia rule, lawlessness, and targeted ethnic violence, which unfortunately affected Armenian communities more than most because they were already a minority, and the government protections they had in the past no longer exist. The government funded programs that helped maintain their culture and their identity for decades and decades no longer exists. So I think that this marked the beginning of a very silent exodus. And I know this because she graduated college in the year 2003 alongside my mother, and she fled directly thereafter as she was hearing kind of talk about the US coming to invade. So that's when she fled, and then my family fled a couple years later, but they've obviously been in contact still. And unfortunately, that is kind of the reality for many Armenian-Iraqis and Iraqis alike. So the Armenian neighborhoods in Baghdad, like the ones she lived in, as she was kind of detailing, were gradually emptied. Churches were bombed or abandoned. Community centers that once hosted choirs, weddings, language classes, and scout troops had disappeared. Political chaos created space for extremist groups. And even in cities like Mosul and Kirkuk, where so many minority groups were kind of honored and were living together symbiotically, places where Armenians had once been woven into the fabric of society, they actually became symbolic targets. Not because of what they'd done, but because of what they represented, which is continuity, difference, faith, and survival. All very fragile parts of their identity that made them that much more susceptible to attacks. And Anna told me her father didn't want to leave Iraq. He tried to delay it as much as he could. He'd served in the army, he built his life there, but when threats of death became daily reality, he had to leave. And her parents to this day, she to this day would like to return, but has not had the opportunity, and that's why she's kind of been able to continue her work of preserving her Armenian identity in Canada, like I said, by hosting like dance recitals and teaching Armenian, and also she's helping publish a book on Armenian identity in the West, which I will share a link to if anyone is interested in looking into that. But a very devastating statistic is that since 2003, more than 70% of Iraq's Christian population has fled the country. So that's between 2003 and 2019. That has made it that much easier for groups like ISIS to target Armenian populations, especially with so many of their churches being either abandoned or just easy places to target, since obviously they were not as present as mosques were. So there has been a movement to try to get Armenians and other Christian minority groups back into Iraq. It hasn't been the most successful. There has been very limited funding and care from the government. The government system as it stands now after the fall of the Saddam Hussein regime is a parliament where there is representation for both Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Kurdish groups, Assyrian Christians, Armenians, Turkomans, and Kurds. But that still has not been enough to maintain the very rich, diverse groups and their kind of like representation equally. So returning to kind of where I began, as I said, the Rome Statute defines genocide as acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. You being here today has made sure that that cannot happen for Armenians, and especially for Iraqi Armenians. While this intent does not announce itself loudly, that was what took place. Sometimes intent is buried beneath 10 centimeters of dirt in a mass grave along the Euphrates River. Sometimes it's encoded in the silence of a city that no longer has an Armenian church, an Armenian school, or an Armenian choir. And sometimes it appears as a spectacle, but that's why this work matters. Its legal evidence, historical archives, and humanitarian truth-telling is one of the only ways that we can help maintain the dialogue about these groups and make sure that they are not forgotten. But since we live in a world where genocide is safely in the past for Armenian groups, we still see a lot of violence taking place now, and it is very important to listen carefully, preserve testimony, and speak these stories aloud in public spaces like this one, whether you're speaking about Ukraine or Rohingya villages in Myanmar or Palestinians in Gaza or Sudanese people in both South Sudan and Darfur, whether you're talking about the injustices happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It is so important to keep telling their stories. And to the Armenians who crossed deserts, rivers, mountains, and decades with nothing but memory carried inside them, this presentation is for you, because you will not be erased, forgotten, or any of the above, and you are still being heard to this day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadia.
That's my contact information, and I'm more than happy to take questions if anyone has any.
Thank you so much. Your project really honors the spirit of not forgetting this group and was really illuminating. So now we are going to open it up for questions for the people in the room, and just on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window, and my colleague Autumn will ask your questions. So.
They won't show up here, right?
No, not there.
Hi. So I'd love to just know a little bit more about, your personal experience growing up in Iraq, and kind of how did you see these communities integrated into yours, and where did you kind of get the idea to focus on this for your project?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in researching issues of human rights and social justice. As Martha mentioned, that's kind of my background, and the majority of the work I've done at USC and through internships and other work experiences. So when I saw this very amazing opportunity to do research with the Center of Advanced Genocide Research, the first thing that came to mind was Armenians, because I was born in Iraq, I was raised in Baghdad, and a lot of my family and their friends were Armenians, and they kind of talked about their history, and it always stuck with me because when I moved to the US, I didn't really hear much about Armenians. Obviously, the Armenian Genocide is acknowledged in the US and it's formally acknowledged by our government now, but that wasn't the case when I came to the US in 2012, I believe. So I kind of remembered their testimonies always, and I thought, why is this not talked about here? Do people not know about this? And then whenever the Armenian Genocide was discussed, Iraq was never talked about. A lot of the Middle Eastern countries that hosted Armenians with populations of, 500, 700,000 people, like in Lebanon and Syria, were never acknowledged. And I found that people didn't know that Armenians were such a big part of Arab culture. A lot of their cuisine is part of our cuisine now. A lot of, their dances and their music, it's integrated into ours now. And we've always kind of lived symbiotically. And that's unfortunately under attack now. So I thought it would be all the more important to do this research now. Thank you. Yes.
How's the economic development or situation in Iraq for Armenians?
I don't think that I would know too much about that.
For example, Baghdad.
I'm sorry?
Baghdad.
Okay.
Baghdad.
What do you mean by economic development, like infrastructure-wise, or?
No, how's the Armenians' wellness in Baghdad?
I think it's roughly the same for Armenians as it is for most other populations in Baghdad. As I mentioned, since over 70% of Iraqi Christians have fled Iraq, there unfortunately isn't many left, and the ones that are left, majority of them aren't Armenian. They tend to be either Assyrian groups or Chaldean Christians. I do believe they are represented in the parliament. They do have a couple seats reserved for Armenians as well as other Christian groups. So that is one way that they've been integrated. I don't know how integrated they have been into the economy, but that is something I'd be interested to look into. So thank you.
They were poor, or they were middle class, or they were rich?
Okay. I would say they were definitely middle class. I don't remember finding much research about them being part of more impoverished communities, just because, as the interview with Anna mentioned, there was government programs to ensure that there was access to Armenian schools and education as Armenians, and all of this was free. Of course, education in Iraq was free up until the college level, which was also free, and Anna was able to attend college for free and engage in those like government-sponsored Armenian programs. So because of that, I think you will find that the majority of Iraqi Armenians were either middle class or upper middle class, just because they had access to the same social services that most people did. Of course, following political instability that we have now, a lot of people are much more vulnerable, including Armenian communities that don't have access to those social programs that kept them afloat and kind of integrated them into Iraqi society.
So it looks like, sorry for talking face to face, looks like the Armenians leave the Iraq after the Iraq war. It looks like it's not about the economic reason, but the identifiable reason.
Yes, exactly.
I'm not saying the political reason, because being a minority, for example, right now in America, minority, I'm from Turkey, I'm a minority person, really. So, it's not easy. There are lots of blockers and things. Even though you're a skillful person, you can get lots of problems. The same things for Armenian, probably. But as I believe in the Middle East, include Turkey, Armenians' economic situation, at least middle class, they're not poor. Mostly,
Yes,
most
correct.
of them.
Correct. Yes.
So one of the things that really interests me about your project are these multiple displacements that you describe, and even thinking about the Armenians that were integrated so well into Iraqi society, then being displaced again. How did they identify? How do kind of do people call themselves like Armenians? Do they call themselves Iraqi Armenians? And how do these multiple displacements affect how people identify themselves?
Yeah, so I think they refer to themselves as Iraqis because the term Iraqi is not inherently Arab. As I mentioned, the majority of Armenians ended up in a lot more diverse cities, like Mosul and Kirkuk, Duhok, Basra, where groups like Kurds, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Turkmens existed. These are not Arab groups. A lot of them are either Christian or participate in other religions that are not Muslim. So to say that you are Iraqi doesn't necessarily mean you're Arab, doesn't necessarily mean you're Muslim. So a lot of these Armenians, the majority of them actually identify as Iraqi first, Armenian second, the same way I identify as Iraqi first, and then for Muslim second, doesn't necessarily complicate, their identity. Yes.
Okay. This is probably outside the scope of your expertise, but have you studied with these individuals the psychological impact of double and triple displacements, as you talked about in your presentation?
So I wasn't able to study that in a lot of detail. I've studied double and triple displacement generally just because I am a pre-law major and I intend to go into law school. So kind of the concept of non-refoulement, if you're not familiar, is of not being able to deport asylum seekers or refugees back to where they came from once they've arrived somewhere. So that was the case for Armenians. They were not able to be deported back, not that they could have been with the Ottoman forces, but because of that, since they couldn't be deported back, they were either moved somewhere new or stay in the same place. The majority of them ended up being moved somewhere new. So a lot of the testimonies talked about that, but they didn't really get into the psychological effects of it. I think that when you're in such a, when you're kind of living on survival mode in a fight or flight kind of position, you're less likely to focus and to kind of pay attention to the psychological impacts, as obviously your kind of main goal is to just survive. Maybe now there is more research on the psychological impact of Armenian survivors specifically. I didn't see that in the Visual History Archive, unfortunately.
Thanks.
Yes.
The things also for immigration. positive and negative. An individual getting acceptance from another country, positive for himself or herself. That's for the individual. That's really positive. I have friends, Armenian friends. They live 3-4 countries, 2-3-4 countries.
Yes.
England, America, French. That's good for those individuals, but that's bad for the what I said. The birthplace, their born place, their culture, birthplace. The fauna, their atmosphere. So Armenian people getting acceptance, as I see, America, initially America, Canada, French, from England, they're getting very easy acceptance. So instead of living in Middle East or even include Armenia now, they have those kind of problems too in Armenia, people living with us, or Turkey, Armenian Turkey.
Yes.
How you looking at this? Their acceptance internationally easy, so they are going to another country very easy. This is positive for the individuals, but it's negative for the Armenian people or Armenian culture in their own soil or on their own countries like Iraq, Armenia, or Iran, or Turkey, or Syria.
Yeah, definitely it's very positive for anyone to have the opportunity to migrate somewhere else. My family had that same opportunity and I'm very thankful to be here. However, like you mentioned, that does kind of impact their ability to maintain their identities. And thankfully we have things like the USC Show Foundation that helps us kind of access like a little glimpse into how these people have been able to maintain their identities. And that's why I will always encourage research like this in order to uplift the voices of Armenians who have been, or any other minority group who has been double, triple, quadruple displaced, because that impacts their identity all that much more and it makes it so much harder to maintain it and preserve it. So I think the only thing we can do is just whenever we see something like this taking place is pay attention to it, listen to these stories. If you run into someone in the streets who's telling you about this, he's like, I'm Armenian and I went through this, listen to their stories. That helps them so much more than you could ever imagine.
I think we have some questions from our online.
We do. We have a question from Zoom from Sarah Ernst, and they ask, they say, first of all, thank you for your presentation. Did any of the survivors talk about the crossroads of the multiple empires, such as the Ottoman, French, or British, as they traveled through Iraq?
Yes, so the two clips I showed of both Giruhi and Bedros, who both tattooed themselves, they were both the most impacted, I would say, or at least they discussed their kind of impact by both French, British, and Ottoman forces, all trying to kind of make their mark on Iraq at the time. So because French occupation was taking place in the northwestern part, the Armenians who were passing through the Sinjar Mountains into Mosul, Kirkuk, and the Tok, they were the most affected because that was where French occupation was taking place. The British took over Basra, which is in the south of Iraq first, and then moved their way up through Baghdad and then Mosul, and then French forces pulled out and the British took place instead. So that was a big part of why a lot of these Armenians were then displaced from one place to another. Bedros actually talked about first landing in the Sinjar Mountains and then being moved to Basra in order to flee French bombardment, but then he had to come back as British bombardment was taking place in the south of Iraq. So that's why a lot of the displacement actually took place more than once. In the case of Giruhi, she specifically talked about why she had those tattoos from her Arab family as they were fleeing French bombardment since they were living in the north. But as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, there wasn't too many testimonies on Armenians in Iraq, so I wasn't able to get like a very firm grasp of just how much they were affected or which specific colonial empire was affecting them the most or impacting them the most. I would assume it would be the Ottoman forces, as they were not only deporting people from Syria, but they were also massacring people in to Syria and then had the intention of moving through into Iraq. So I'm assuming that is the case, but that is something I would probably have to research more before I give a concrete answer.
We also have another question from Alexa Gorski, who joined on Zoom. First of all, she just wanted to congratulate you on your presentation. She said that until your presentation, she didn't know that Armenians use tattoos as a method of maintaining Armenian identity, but she wanted to know if you found any other instances of tattooing in your research as being self-administered or a positive element, or if this was an isolated incident.
Yeah. Well, first of all, for those who don't know, Alexa was another one of our research fellows over the summer, and she did research here as well. And hi, Alexa. So yes, this was actually a pattern I found in the research. So I found it to be a pattern in Syria as well. My research specifically focused on Iraq, but it was a pattern in Syria as well, because a lot of Middle Eastern tribes and clans at the time, not necessarily just Arabs, a lot of Kurdish groups as well, would have facial tattoos. It was kind of part of the culture. So a lot of Armenians chose to do that in order to blend in and not be identified as Armenians, whether they changed their name or they got tattoos or they wanted to convert to Islam in order to protect their identities. That was the case. But in some of the clips I showed, it was actually self-administered as a way to preserve identity. So I think it was used for a multitude of reasons, and I did find it to be a pattern across a lot of different Middle Eastern countries at the time, for a variety of reasons, but from what I gathered, it was mostly kind of self-induced, and it had a positive effect, whether it was to hide your identity or to preserve it. But yeah.
Another question from Stephen Hicks Achimpong. Sorry if I didn't get your last name right. But he wanted to know, what was the Armenian community's reaction or response to Saddam Hussein's annexation of Kuwait as its 19th province in the 1990s?
Interesting question. In regards to Saddam Hussein's annexation of Kuwait, I think the majority of people's reaction in Iraq at the time, including my own family's, was obviously not only disappointment, but sheer terror, because you would be militarily deployed to go fight in that for that annexation. However, it's not something that anyone could have opposed, as it was a dictatorship. So I don't think their reactions were different from anyone else. And even if they were, I don't think it's something that has been publicly documented just because you weren't allowed to oppose something like that. The majority of people obviously did oppose. But I don't think that there has been any records of the Armenian genocide the Armenian reaction to the annexation of Kuwait, just because that is something that was not obviously publicized, and you didn't really have freedom of speech to disagree with something like that. I'm sure we can find information on that now, but I do know that a lot of Armenians were in the military at the time, and they definitely fought in the Iran war in the 80s. So I'm sure they also fought for the annexation of Kuwait under duress at the time.
All right. Oh, go ahead.
I love your presentation.
Thank you.
Really nice. I want to ask you, do you keep in touch with anybody in your hometown in Iraq around your age to this day?
I do, yes. Okay. Just some family friends that I grew up with, but the majority of Iraqis I do keep in touch with are also living abroad now.
Yeah, I figured. I didn't know if he's still back there. So
yeah, I do have the majority of my family still living there. So yeah, but I don't know if I'm gonna go back here. Sorry. The church you see here is an Armenian church in Baghdad. It still stands to this day. So there are people that attend this church. However, the churches in Mosul, which is where I'm from, have been the most heavily impacted, because that is the city where ISIS took siege and was there for a couple of years. So those were the most impacted. But in Baghdad, you can definitely see a lot of remnants of Armenian culture still.
Do you wish to go back? I guess. To do more for you people?
Definitely. I definitely do. I tend to visit every summer. That unfortunately was not the case this past summer, but hopefully things are a little more stable and airspaces are open so I can go back. I'd like to keep on doing research like this just because I come from a part of Iraq that has always been known to be like a minority-majority city. And a lot of those groups were more heavily impacted than anyone else. So I would love to do work that kind of amplifies the voices for sure. Thank you.
Please join me in and we hope that you join us next week at 12 o'clock and the week after that and the week after that. And we look forward to a lively semester. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.